There is a specific kind of silence that buries the Cascade Mountains during a whiteout blizzard. It isn't a peaceful quiet. It is a heavy, suffocating weight that presses against the glass of your windows, reminding you that if the power fails, you are entirely cut off from the rest of the world. My wife, Clara, was 8 months pregnant. We had moved to a beautiful, isolated A-frame cabin off a private logging road, thinking it would be the perfect, quiet place to raise our 4-year-old son, Julian. It was mid-January when the worst storm of the decade hit. The power grid failed just after sunset. By 2 a.m., the temperature inside the cabin was dropping rapidly. I was awake in the pitch-black living room, sitting on the rug, quietly feeding split pine logs into the cast-iron wood stove. The only light in the house was the dancing, frantic orange glow of the embers. Then I heard the stairs creak. I turned around. Clara was standing at the bottom of the staircase. She was clutching her swollen belly, her face pale and glistening with the cold sweat in the dim firelight. She looked completely terrified.
"Arthur,"
she whispered, her voice trembling violently.
"do you hear that?"
I stood up, wiping the soot from my hands. I strained my ears against the howling wind battering the roof. At first, I heard nothing, just the deep structural groans of the timber holding up the house. Then it cut through the storm.
"Mommy, please, it's cold. Mommy, let me in."
My blood turned to ice. My heart stopped dead in my chest. It was Julian. It was the exact, undeniable pitch of my 4-year-old son's voice. He was crying, a raw, hysterical, breathless sobbing that came from directly outside our heavy oak front door. "He got out," Clara gasped, a sound of pure maternal agony tearing from her throat.
"Arthur, he wandered out. He's freezing."
She didn't wait for me. Clara lunged toward the entryway. In her panicked, frantic state, she wasn't thinking about how a toddler could have unlatched the heavy deadbolt, or how he could have opened the frozen door and closed it behind him. The primal instinct to protect her child had completely overridden her logic. "Clara, wait!" I yelled, but she was already at the door. Her trembling hands reached for the heavy brass lock. The voice outside grew louder, more desperate.
"Mommy, it hurts. Open the door."
Something was wrong, deeply, viscerally wrong. The voice was loud, too loud. It was piercing through 2 inches of solid oak and a howling blizzard with impossible clarity. It didn't sound like a child pressing his face against the wood. It sounded like it was being projected. I sprinted across the room. I tackled her. I grabbed Clara by the waist and pulled her backward just as her fingers grazed the cold metal of the deadbolt. We collapsed onto the hardwood floor.
"Let me go!"
she screamed, thrashing against me with terrifying strength.
"He's out there. Julian is out there."
"Listen to me," I roared, pinning her arms down. "Look at me!" I forced her to look into my eyes. My chest was heaving. "Julian is asleep," I said, my voice shaking. "I just checked his room 10 minutes ago. He is upstairs." Clara stopped thrashing. She went stock still. Her wide, terrified eyes darted from my face to the dark ceiling above us.
"Mommy, please, Mommy."
The voice outside looped. It was the exact same cadence, the exact same breath between the words. It wasn't a living child reacting to our screams. It was a recording, or something mimicking a recording. I helped Clara up. I left her by the fireplace and sprinted up the dark stairs, taking them 2 at a time. I threw open the door to Julian's nursery. He was there, tucked warmly under his dinosaur quilt, his small chest rising and falling in a deep, peaceful sleep. He hadn't moved. I locked his bedroom door from the inside and carried him downstairs. When Clara saw him, she collapsed to her knees, burying her face in his neck, sobbing quietly. We sat huddled around the wood stove for the rest of the night. My loaded 12-gauge shotgun was resting across my lap. The entire time, for 4 agonizing hours, that voice kept crying outside our door. The exact same loop, over and over. We thought it was a skinwalker, a wendigo, some ancient demonic entity from the deep woods trying to trick us into inviting it inside. When dawn finally broke, the storm passed. The crying had stopped hours ago. I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the frozen porch, my shotgun raised, expecting to see cloven hooves or the massive, unnatural tracks of a forest monster. What I found was infinitely worse. There were no monster tracks. There were human footprints. Heavy, size 12 combat boots pressed deep into the fresh snow. They led up to our porch, paced back and forth, and then retreated into the dense tree line. And sitting right on the railing of our porch, half buried in the snow, was a cheap black Bluetooth speaker. It wasn't a demon mimicking our son. Someone had been watching us. Someone had hidden in the trees days earlier, secretly recording Julian while he was crying over a scraped knee in the front yard. And last night, knowing the power was out, that psychopath had stood in the freezing dark, playing our child's pain on a loop, just waiting for us to unlock the door. Monsters are real, but they don't have fur or fangs. They wear winter coats, they leave boot prints, and they know exactly how to use your own heart against you. There is a deep, ancient quiet that settles over the Shenandoah Valley in late November. It is a heavy, isolating silence, thickened by the dense, freezing fog that rolls down the mountainsides and swallows the hollows. I lived alone in a restored, single-room hunting cabin miles off the main county road. I loved the solitude. I loved the feeling that the rest of the frantic, noisy world simply did not exist. It was a Tuesday night. The temperature had plunged well below freezing. I was sitting in my favorite armchair by the cast-iron wood stove, reading a book by the amber light of a single kerosene lamp. The only sounds were the rhythmic, soothing tick-tock of the wall clock and the dry crackle of the burning pine logs. Then, the silence shattered. It was faint at first, easily muffled by the thick logs of the cabin walls, but the pitch was unmistakable. Wah! Wah! I froze. I slowly closed my book. I held my breath, straining my ears against the dead quiet of the room. It came again. A high, thin, piercing wail. It was a baby crying. My heart did a strange, painful flutter in my chest. I looked at the wall clock. It was 2:15 a.m. My nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, down a treacherous, unpaved mountain switchback. It was physically impossible for an infant to be out in those pitch-black woods. But the crying continued. It sounded like it was coming from the edge of the tree line, just beyond my front yard. My grandfather, who had built this cabin, used to tell me terrifying stories about the things that lived deep in the Appalachian timber. He called them the mimics. He swore that there were ancient, starving predators out there that possessed the vocal cords of a parrot, but the malice of a demon. They would perfectly replicate the sound of a weeping woman or a distressed child, waiting in the dark for a compassionate, foolish human to step off their porch to help. "If you hear a baby in the woods at night," he used to tell me, his eyes dead serious, "you lock the door and you pray, because whatever is making that noise is hoping you come looking." A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I stood up. I walked to the heavy oak door and made sure the deadbolt was thrown. But as I backed away, the crying grew louder, more desperate, more frantic. My maternal instinct waged a violent war against my logic. What if it wasn't a legend? What if a car had gone off the ridge above my property? What if a mother was dead and a real, freezing child was lying out there in the frost? I couldn't just sit by the fire. I walked to the lockbox under my bed and pulled out my grandfather's heavy .38 special revolver. The iron was freezing against my palm. The weight of the gun grounded me. I walked back to the front door. I took a deep breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and pushed the door open. The biting, icy wind hit my face like a physical blow. I stepped out onto the wooden planks of the porch. I reached over and flicked on the heavy exterior floodlight. The harsh white beam cut through the swirling, suffocating fog, illuminating the frost-covered grass of my front yard, stopping right at the impenetrable wall of pine trees. The crying was so loud now. It was coming from right inside the brush. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice trembling. The crying abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was infinitely more terrifying. I aimed the revolver at the tree line, my hands shaking violently. Then I heard the movement. Crunch, drag, snap. It was a heavy, uneven footstep. Something massive was pushing its way through the dense rhododendron bushes. A hulking, misshapen silhouette breached the edge of the fog. My blood ran completely cold. It was gigantic, easily 6'4", but its posture was entirely wrong. It was hunched over, asymmetrical, and moving with a terrifying, dragging lurch. Thud, drag, thud. As it staggered into the edge of the light, I heard it breathing. It wasn't human. It was a wet, guttural, rattling rasp, like a massive animal choking on its own blood. It was clutching a dark, bulky mass against its chest. It saw me. It let out a horrific, gurgling groan and lunged forward. Panic exploded in my brain. It was charging the porch. "Stop!" I screamed. I pulled back the hammer of the revolver. Click. "I will shoot you! Stop!" It didn't stop. It hit the bottom of the wooden stairs. Thud, thud. It was on the porch. The massive shadow loomed over me. I squeezed my eyes shut. My finger tightened on the trigger. Then the monster collapsed. It didn't attack. It simply lost its footing and crashed violently onto the hardwood planks right at my feet. I gasped, stumbling backward against the doorframe, my gun still aimed at the massive shape. The floodlight was shining directly down on it now. I opened my eyes. The adrenaline drained from my body, replaced instantly by a wave of pure, sickening shock. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a creature covered in fur. It was a man in a torn, blood-soaked flannel shirt. I recognized him. It was Silas, the severely autistic, mute hermit who lived in a rundown trailer a few miles up the mountain. He was terribly disfigured from a childhood fire, which gave him that terrifying, asymmetrical appearance. He wasn't charging me to attack. He was dying. His right leg was visibly shattered, a piece of bone protruding through his denim jeans. His face was covered in dark blood, and his wet, rattling breathing was the sound of a punctured lung struggling for air. Silas looked up at me with terrified, pleading eyes. With the last ounce of strength he possessed, he uncurled his massive, scarred arms and pushed the dark mass he was holding toward my boots. It was a bundle of heavy winter coats. The bundle squirmed. "Wah!" The crying resumed. I dropped the gun. It clattered against the wood. I fell to my knees and ripped the coats open. Inside, perfectly unharmed and radiating warmth, was a tiny infant. I looked past Silas. Far off in the distance, down in the steep ravine near the main highway, I could see the faint, flickering orange glow of a vehicle fire. Silas hadn't lured me out. He hadn't been hunting me. This severely disabled man, whom the whole town treated like a monster, had crawled down into a burning wreckage, pulled a survivor from the flames, and dragged himself up a 100-foot embankment on a shattered leg just to bring the child to the only porch light he could see in the fog. I sat on the freezing wood, clutching the crying baby to my chest, weeping as I watched Silas take his final, rattling breath. We spend so much time terrified of the monsters hiding in the dark.
But the real tragedy is that sometimes we are too blind to recognize an angel, simply because his wings are broken.
There is a comforting, almost nostalgic quality to the smell of an old attic. It's a dry, papery scent, a mix of cedarwood, mothballs, and decades of undisturbed dust. When my great-aunt passed away, she left me her sprawling 3-story Victorian house in the quiet suburbs of Portland, Maine. It was a beautiful home, but the attic was a chaotic labyrinth of forgotten history. It was a late Friday night in November. A freezing, steady rain was drumming a hypnotic rhythm against the slate roof shingles just inches above my head. I was sitting cross-legged on the rough wooden floorboards, bathed in the weak, amber glow of a single bare light bulb hanging from a rafter. I was safely surrounded by towers of cardboard boxes, methodically sorting through old photo albums. It was peaceful. It was completely ordinary. Then, the rain suddenly stopped. It didn't taper off, it just ceased, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. The air in the attic seemed to thicken. The temperature, which had been comfortably chilly, plummeted so fast that my breath began to plume in the dim light. I stopped turning the pages of the album. A strange, metallic scent drifted into the small perimeter of my light. It smelled like old copper pennies mixed with the sharp, sour tang of unwashed hair and rotting meat. I sat stock still. Every primal instinct in my body flared to life. Ha 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 ha! My blood turned to ice. It was right behind me, right above my left shoulder. It was the sound of heavy, wet panting. It was deep. It was guttural. It sounded exactly like a massive, exhausted dog, like a mastiff or a Great Dane, struggling to catch its breath after a long run. The volume was impossible. It was so close that I could actually hear the thick saliva clicking in the back of its throat. I couldn't breathe. My chest locked. I felt a hot, humid wave of putrid air wash over the nape of my neck with every exhalation. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the Barghest, the invisible, spectral hounds that haunt old bloodlines, appearing only to breathe down the necks of those about to die. I had laughed at him. Now I was paralyzed. I squeezed my eyes shut. It's just the wind, I lied to myself. It's an old, drafty house. But the wind doesn't drool. The wind doesn't have a heartbeat. It was leaning closer. The hot breath ruffled the collar of my flannel shirt. Panic exploded in my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the heavy, iron-wrought flashlight resting on the floor beside me, gripped it like a club, and spun around violently. "Get back!" I screamed. My flashlight beam tore through the darkness. Nothing. The space behind me was completely empty. Just more cardboard boxes, an antique dress form, and the thick, undisturbed layer of dust on the floorboards. There were no massive paw prints. There was no giant, shadowy beast. I was completely alone. I let out a ragged, hysterical gasp of relief. My mind had played a trick on me. It was just a panic attack. But then, my blood ran cold all over again. The panting hadn't stopped. It was still right there. I was staring at empty space, but the wet, rasping sound was echoing loudly in my ears. It was invisible. It was a ghost. It was a demon standing right in front of me, breathing heavily, entirely unseen.
My breathing grew rapid, short, frantic. I backed up. My shoulder blades hit the rough wood of the chimney column. Ha, ha, ha. The sound didn't follow me. It stayed exactly where I had been sitting. I swallowed hard. My trembling hand slowly raised the flashlight, tracing the origin of the sound. I pointed the beam not at the empty space in the room, but at the wall I had just been sitting against. Right at the level where my head had been, cut into the wooden paneling, was an old, louvered iron ventilation grate. It connected the attic to the dead space behind the house's walls. The heavy, wet panting was coming from inside the vent. I took a slow, agonizing step forward. I angled the beam of the flashlight directly through the rusted iron slats of the grate. The light didn't hit a ghost. It didn't hit an invisible hellhound. It hit a pair of wide, bloodshot human eyes. A man was wedged inside the cramped, pitch-black crawl space behind the wall. His face was filthy, smeared with grease and dirt. His lips were chapped and bleeding, parted wide as he hyperventilated in the suffocating heat of the hidden shaft. He had been standing in the walls, pressing his face against the iron grate, watching me sort through boxes, breathing heavily directly onto the back of my neck. When the light hit his face, the panting instantly stopped. The man smiled. It was a wide, jagged, horrifying grin. He slowly raised a long, filthy kitchen knife until the blade tapped gently against the iron slats. I didn't scream. I turned and ran for the attic stairs, locking the heavy deadbolt behind me, and called the police. They found a sleeping bag, my missing kitchen food, and a collection of my photographs inside the walls. He had been living up there for 3 weeks. We tell ghost stories to make sense of the bumps in the night. We want to believe it's an invisible monster or a phantom hound, because the terrifying truth is, the real monsters don't phase through walls. They crawl inside them, and they wait for you to sit down in the dark. There is a suffocating weight to a late August night in the Louisiana bayou. The air doesn't just surround you, it clings to you. It is a thick, humid membrane that carries the overwhelming scent of stagnant water, decaying cypress trees, and wet Spanish moss. I lived in a raised, single-story house at the very end of a dead-end gravel road. The back of the house was entirely comprised of floor-to-ceiling glass doors that looked out over a pitch-black expanse of untamed swampland. I was a single mother raising my 3-year-old son, Toby. The isolation was supposed to be a fresh start for us, a place to hide and heal. It was 9 p.m. I was standing at the kitchen island, scrubbing the last of the dinner plates under a stream of warm water. The house was quiet, save for the low mechanical hum of the refrigerator and the deafening, rhythmic roar of the cicadas outside. I wiped my hands on a towel and looked over my shoulder. Toby wasn't playing with his blocks on the living room rug. He was standing completely flush against the massive glass patio doors. His small hands were pressed flat against the cold pane. He was staring out into the absolute darkness of the swamp. And he was talking. It wasn't his usual loud toddler babble. It was a hushed, rhythmic mumbling, a secretive, two-sided conversation. He would whisper something into the glass, pause as if listening to a response, and then giggle softly. A sudden, irrational chill crawled up my spine. "Toby, baby?" I called out, my voice sounding incredibly thin in the large room. "What are you doing over there? It's time for bed." He didn't turn around. He just slowly raised his right arm and pointed his little index finger straight out into the dark. "The tall man is funny," Toby whispered. My heart skipped a painful beat. I slowly put the towel down on the counter. The swamp is pitch black at night. Without the exterior floodlights on, looking out those glass doors is like looking into a void. You can't see the trees, you can't see the water. I walked across the hardwood floor, my bare feet making no sound. The closer I got to the glass, the colder the ambient temperature seemed to drop. "What tall man, sweetie?" I asked, trying to keep the rising panic out of my voice. I knelt down beside him. Toby kept his finger extended.
He's hiding. He's playing a game. He says he wants to come inside and play.
I pressed my face close to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to block out the warm, yellow light of the living room lamps. I strained my eyes against the darkness. I expected to see a stray dog, a coyote, maybe a wandering deer. But there was nothing. Just the endless, impenetrable black wall of the bayou. Then I heard it. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a low, guttural, vibrating hum. It was a deep, rhythmic vibration that I could actually feel resonating against the thick glass pane. Someone, or something, was standing right on the other side of the glass, out in the pitch-black night, humming a lullaby. The cicadas abruptly stopped. The frogs fell dead silent. The natural world was holding its breath. "He says you need to open the door, Mommy," Toby mumbled, his eyes wide and vacant. Pure, primal terror exploded in my chest. Local legends of swamp monsters and skinwalkers flooded my mind. Something ancient and evil had crawled out of the mud, and it was standing inches away, trying to lure my baby out. I grabbed Toby by the waist and violently yanked him away from the door. "No!" I hissed, my chest heaving. I reached out and slammed my hand against the heavy brass lock, ensuring the deadbolt was thrown tight. I needed to see it. I needed to know what was out there. "Stay behind me," I whispered. I reached out to the wall switch next to the patio door. If I killed the interior lights, the glare on the glass would vanish. I would be able to see exactly what was standing on my deck. I flipped the switch. Click. The living room plunged into absolute darkness. The only light left was a faint, sickly beam of moonlight filtering in through the kitchen window behind us. I leaned forward. My breath fogged the cold glass. I stared furiously into the dark swamp. Empty. There was no monster on the deck. There was no giant creature. The wooden planks of the patio were completely bare. Toby giggled again in the dark.
"Silly Mommy," he whispered. "He's not outside."
My blood turned to ice. My lungs seized. I looked down at Toby in the dim moonlight. He wasn't pointing through the glass anymore. With the interior lights off, the thick, double-paned window was acting as a perfect mirror. Toby was pointing at the reflection in the glass. He was pointing at the reflection of our living room. I slowly, agonizingly, raised my eyes from Toby's finger to the reflection in the window. Standing exactly 10 feet behind me, silhouetted in the faint moonlight spilling from the kitchen, was a towering, emaciated figure. It was a man. He was holding a heavy, rusted tire iron. He wasn't a monster from the swamp. He was the violent, estranged ex-husband I had fled across 3 states to escape. He hadn't been standing on the deck. He had picked the kitchen door lock an hour ago. He had been standing in the dark hallway behind us the entire time, whispering to our son while I washed the dishes. The man in the reflection smiled. His teeth gleamed in the dark. I didn't scream. I scooped Toby into my arms, spun around, and ran blindly toward the front door. We tell ourselves ghost stories because the supernatural is a comfortable fiction. We want to believe the monsters are hiding deep in the woods, kept at bay by locked doors and porch lights. Because the most terrifying truth in the world is that the real monsters know exactly where you live. And sometimes, they are already inside the house. There is a unique, suffocating kind of claustrophobia that comes with camping at the bottom of a slot canyon. When you are 2 miles deep into the sandstone labyrinth of the Utah Badlands, the sky is reduced to a thin, jagged ribbon of stars, hundreds of feet above your head. The towering rock walls press in on you from both sides, trapping the freezing night air and amplifying every single sound. A dropping pebble sounds like a gunshot. The wind doesn't blow, it howls through the narrow corridors like a dying animal. My climbing partner, David, and I had been hiking for 10 hours. We were exhausted, our muscles burning and our hands blistered from the ropes. We had finally set up a small base camp on a dry sandbank where the canyon widened just enough to pitch a single tent. It was almost midnight. The temperature had plummeted to freezing. I was sitting cross-legged on the sand, hunched over our tiny butane camp stove, watching the blue flame hiss as I waited for the water to boil for our freeze-dried meals. David had walked back down the pitch-black corridor of the canyon about 20 minutes ago with his headlamp. He said he needed to double-check the anchor on our climbing ropes for the morning ascent. I heard his heavy boots crunching softly on the gravel before I saw him. He walked back into the dim, amber halo of our camping lantern. He didn't say a word. He just slumped down on a boulder on the opposite side of the stove, pulling the heavy, fur-lined hood of his distinct bright red parka over his head to block the biting wind. He buried his hands deep in his pockets and kept his head down, staring into the blue flame. "Rope secure?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly off the smooth sandstone walls. He gave a slow, subtle nod. He didn't look up. I smiled, assuming he was just completely dead on his feet. The silence returned, filled only by the aggressive, rhythmic hiss of the pressurized butane stove. The smell of burning gas and ancient dry dust hung heavy in the freezing air. I poured the boiling water into our foil pouches. Then a sound cut through the hiss of the stove. "Hey!" I froze. The aluminum pot in my hand hovered in midair. The voice didn't come from the man sitting 3 feet across from me. It came from deep inside the pitch-black throat of the canyon, from the exact direction David had walked earlier. It was faint, swallowed by the winding rock walls, but the pitch was unmistakable. It was David's voice. I let out a nervous, confused breath. I looked across the stove. The man in the red parka was still sitting stock still, his head bowed, his face entirely obscured by the fur hood. "David?" I whispered. "Mark, please." The voice echoed down the canyon again. It wasn't a casual call. It was a wet, ragged gasp. It was the sound of a man who was desperately fighting for air. My blood turned to ice. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Local legends of skinwalkers and canyon spirits flooded my mind. I had read the stories. Ancient things that lived in the deepest crevices of the earth, perfectly mimicking the voices of loved ones to lure hikers into the dark. Something was out there in the pitch-black void, pretending to be my best friend. "Do you hear that?" I asked the figure across the stove, my voice trembling violently. "Something is out there." The figure in the red parka didn't move. He didn't speak. He just sat there. "Mark! Oh God! He cut the rope! Mark, help me!" The scream tore through the canyon. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. It was David. It was undeniably, absolutely David. And he was dying in the dark. My logic violently collided with reality. A horrifying, paralyzing realization washed over me. I looked at the blue flame of the stove. I looked at the heavy boots of the man sitting across from me. They were covered in thick, dark mud. There was no mud in this dry canyon. My breathing grew rapid, short, frantic. I slowly, agonizingly, reached for the heavy metal flashlight resting on the sand beside my knee. My fingers wrapped around the cold aluminum grip. I pointed it directly at the figure in the red parka. I clicked the button. A blinding beam of white light hit the man. The figure slowly raised his head. The heavy fur hood fell back. It wasn't a ghost mimicking my friend. It wasn't a skinwalker in the dark. The man sitting 3 feet away from me was a complete stranger. His face was weathered, deeply scarred, and smeared with fresh, glistening blood. His eyes were wide, manic, and terrifyingly calm. He was wearing David's red parka. The sleeves were soaked in crimson. He hadn't spoken because he didn't know my name. He had just walked into my camp, wearing my dying best friend's coat, and sat down to wait for me to turn my back. The stranger smiled, a jagged, horrifying grin. He slowly pulled a long, serrated hunting knife from the pocket of the parka. I didn't scream. I threw the boiling water directly into his face, scrambled backward into the pitch-black canyon, and ran blindly into the dark. We are so conditioned to fear the supernatural. We terrify ourselves with stories of demons and mimics calling from the shadows. But the truth is infinitely more horrifying. The monsters aren't hiding in the dark calling your name. The real monsters just kill your friends, steal their clothes, and sit right next to you at the fire. There is a distinct, suffocating quality to the silence of a massive, unfinished subterranean structure. When a project is abandoned deep underground, it doesn't just feel empty. It feels like a tomb waiting to be filled. I was working the night shift as a fire watch security guard for the Blackwood Transit Authority. Deep beneath the city was a 3-mile stretch of concrete subway tunnel that had been abandoned due to funding cuts a decade ago. It was a cavernous, curving tube of raw concrete, rusted rebar, and stagnant puddles. There was no lighting. There was no cell service. The only illumination came from the heavy halogen flashlight in my hand. It was 3 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday. I was about a mile into the pitch-black tunnel, doing my routine patrol. The air was incredibly heavy, tasting of copper, wet cement, and ancient dust. The temperature was so low that my breath plumed in the beam of my flashlight like thick gray smoke. The silence down there is enough to drive a person mad. To keep myself grounded, I had developed a habit of whistling. I pursed my lips and whistled a simple, cheerful, 4-note melody. The sound bounced off the curved concrete walls, traveling down the tunnel, fading slowly into the crushing dark. I kept walking, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my heavy boots. Then, out of the pitch-black void ahead of me, the sound returned. Fui, foo, fui, foo. I stopped walking. I smiled in the dark. It was a perfect, crystal-clear echo of my 4-note melody. The acoustics in this massive concrete tube were truly incredible. It took a full 10 seconds for the sound to hit the end of the line and bounce back to me. I decided to test it. I took a deep breath and whistled a more complex, rapid tune, a jazzy, upbeat rhythm. I waited. The freezing air stung my cheeks. 10 seconds passed. Then, from the absolute darkness miles ahead, fui, foo, fui, foo. My smile vanished. My blood turned to ice. That wasn't an echo. An echo degrades. An echo loses its sharp edges as it bounces off the rough concrete. This whistle was crisp. It was loud. And, more terrifyingly, it was slightly off-tempo. It was a deliberate, mocking imitation. I stood stock still. The heavy silence rushed back into the tunnel. My mind raced, desperately trying to rationalize. A homeless drifter? Another urban explorer?
I reached up with a trembling hand and slowly pulled the zipper of my heavy winter coat all the way up to my chin. Zip. I held my breath. I waited.
5 seconds later, from the dark void, exactly 50 yards ahead of me. Zip! It wasn't a vocal mimicry. Whatever was standing in the dark had perfectly replicated the mechanical, metallic sound of my zipper. And it was much, much closer than the last whistle. Panic, cold and electric, flooded my veins. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Local urban legends whispered about the tunnel crawlers, pale, blind, subterranean things that mimicked human sounds to lure workers into the deep water. I had laughed at those stories. Now, standing in the pitch-black cold, I was paralyzed by them. I took one slow, agonizing step backward. Crunch. My boot ground into the gravel. Instantly, from the dark. Crunch. It took a step forward. It was matching me. I took 3 rapid steps backward. Crunch, 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 crunch. The heavy, echoing footsteps bounded out of the darkness. It was closing the distance. It was playing a game, and I was the toy. I spun around and ran. I sprinted blindly down the concrete tube. I didn't care about the noise. I didn't care about the gravel. My flashlight beam bounced wildly against the walls. Behind me, the heavy thudding footsteps matched my sprint perfectly, accompanied by a high-pitched, psychotic, continuous whistling of my own jazzy tune. It was fast. It was terrifyingly fast. I spotted the heavy steel door of a maintenance utility room carved into the tunnel wall. I lunged for it, ripped it open, threw myself inside, and slammed the heavy iron door shut. I threw the deadbolt. I backed into the corner of the tiny, windowless concrete room. I killed my flashlight. Absolute, suffocating darkness. My breathing was rapid, short, frantic. I clamped both hands over my mouth, terrified the sound of my own lungs would give me away. Outside the heavy steel door, the sprinting footsteps stopped. The whistling stopped. The silence was agonizing. I waited for the monstrous claws to scrape against the metal. I expected a demon from the deep earth to tear the hinges off. Then, a voice spoke from the other side of the door. It wasn't an echo. It was a calm, gentle, incredibly familiar human voice. "Hey, kid, you in there?" My breath hitched. "It's Dave, your supervisor," the voice continued smoothly. "Unlock the door. You left your thermos in the security booth. I came down to bring it to you." Dave. The sweet, gray-haired man who had hired me.
The man who gave me a pat on the back and a warm cup of coffee just 3 hours ago. I slowly lowered my hands from my mouth. A wave of immense relief washed over me. It was just a cruel prank. It was Dave checking up on me. I took a step toward the steel door. My hand reached for the deadbolt, but as my fingers grazed the cold iron lock, my logic violently caught up with my relief. The maintenance room was completely soundproof. It was lined with heavy acoustic foam to dampen the noise of the massive water pumps. There was absolutely no way Dave could have known I was inside this specific room in the pitch black, unless he possessed military-grade night vision. I froze. I slowly backed away from the door. "Come on, kid," Dave's voice cooed from the hallway. "Open the door. I have your coffee." Then, a sound slipped under the heavy steel frame. It was the faint, unmistakable swing of a long, serrated hunting knife being slowly pulled from a leather sheath, followed immediately by a cheerful 4-note whistle. I sat on the concrete floor, gripping my heavy flashlight like a club, waiting for the deadbolt to be picked. We spend our lives terrified of the ghosts and the monsters lurking in the dark. But the most horrifying truth is that the devil doesn't have horns or pale skin.
He has gray hair, a warm smile, and he knows exactly where you work.
There is a profound, isolating emptiness that blankets the rural plains of Ohio in late November. When the harvest is over and the fields are cut down to rotting stubble, the land feels completely dead. I lived with my wife, Nora, and our 5-year-old son, Leo, in a massive century-old farmhouse that sat a mile off the main highway. Behind our property was a dense, ancient stretch of oak and pine woods that swallowed the fading sunlight by 4 p.m. It was a bitterly cold Tuesday evening. The temperature had plummeted, freezing the mud in the driveway into jagged, rock-hard ridges. I was out in the detached barn, struggling to fix a blown gasket on my old tractor. The smell of diesel fuel and old hay hung heavy in the freezing air. Around 5:30 p.m., I wiped my greasy hands on a rag and stepped out of the barn. The sun was completely gone. The property was bathed in the sickly pale light of a rising crescent moon. The silence was absolute. There were no crickets, no wind, just the terrifying, breathless quiet of a deep freeze. I looked toward the house, expecting to see the warm yellow glow of the kitchen windows, but the house was entirely dark. My brow furrowed. I took a step toward the gravel driveway. That was when a movement caught my eye. About 50 yards away, moving away from the dark house and heading directly toward the impenetrable black wall of the woods, were 2 silhouettes. My heart did a strange, painful flutter. The moonlight was dim, but the colors were undeniable. It was Nora's bright crimson winter parka, and holding her hand was a smaller figure wearing Leo's reflective yellow rain jacket. "Nora?" I called out, my voice sounding incredibly thin in the massive frozen expanse. They didn't stop. They didn't even turn their heads. They kept walking, moving at a slow, methodical pace. A wave of irrational, primal dread washed over me. Something was deeply, viscerally wrong with the way they were moving. They were gliding. The frost-covered grass usually crunched loudly under heavy winter boots, but they weren't making a single sound. They were just drifting silently over the frozen earth, completely stiff, staring straight ahead into the black timber. Supernatural lore flooded my panicked mind. I had heard the terrifying stories of Appalachian mimics and skinwalkers, ancient, demonic things that stole the shapes of the people you loved, luring you deep into the forest where no one could hear you scream. "Nora, stop!" I roared, dropping my wrench. It clattered loudly against the frozen mud. They reached the edge of the tree line. The darkness of the pines seemed to reach out and pull them in. The crimson coat and the yellow jacket vanished into the pitch-black void. Panic exploded in my chest. They were sleepwalking. Or they were possessed. Or something was dragging them away. I sprinted. My heavy work boots hammered against the frozen ground. My lungs burned with the icy air. I tore across the yard, vaulting over the rotting wooden fence, and plunged headfirst into the freezing, suffocating darkness of the woods. "Nora! Leo!" I screamed frantically. The woods were pitch black, stock still. I scrambled through the dense briars, branches whipping my face and tearing my skin. I chased the faint, imagined flashes of crimson and yellow through the trees. I pushed deeper and deeper into the forest, completely blind, driven by pure adrenaline-fueled terror. I ran for almost 10 minutes. Then I stopped. I stood completely alone in the absolute dark. I was surrounded by towering pines. I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. There was no one here. The woods were entirely empty. My breathing was rapid, short, frantic. I had lost them. The forest had taken my family. I turned around, tears of absolute despair freezing on my cheeks, and sprinted blindly back toward the property.
I burst out of the tree line, my chest heaving, expecting to find my home empty and cursed. I ran up the porch steps and slammed my shoulder into the heavy oak front door. It burst open. I stumbled into the dark hallway.
Arthur?
A terrified, trembling voice whispered from the darkness of the living room. I froze. I slowly reached out and clicked the light switch. Sitting on the floor, huddled behind the heavy oak coffee table, was my wife. She was clutching Leo tightly to her chest. They were both shaking violently, their faces pale with absolute terror. They weren't wearing their winter coats. They were in their pajamas. "Nora?" I gasped, falling to my knees, my mind completely breaking. You were in the woods. I just chased you into the woods." "No," Nora sobbed, her voice breaking. "We've been hiding. They cut the power, Arthur. 2 men broke in through the back door 10 minutes ago. They went straight to the closet. They took my red coat and Leo's jacket." My blood turned to ice. The suffocating dread in my chest crystallized into pure, horrifying realization. It wasn't a skinwalker. It wasn't a ghost mimicking my family to lure me to my death. It was 2 armed, calculating home invaders. They had watched me working in the barn. They knew I was a large, capable man, holding heavy steel tools. So, they broke in, put on my family's brightly colored coats, and intentionally walked out into the moonlight where I could see them. They had deliberately lured the armed husband deep into the freezing, pitch-black woods, leaving the house completely defenseless for the rest of their crew. I slowly turned my head and looked down the dark, silent hallway of my home. The floorboards upstairs groaned. Creak. A heavy footstep. We tell ourselves ghost stories to cope with the shadows. But the most terrifying truth in the world is that the devil doesn't need magic to trick you.
He just needs your wife's coat, the dark of the woods, and your own desperate love to trap you perfectly. There is a relentless, punishing quality to the weather on the jagged coast of Oregon in late November. The ocean doesn't just meet the land, it wages a violent war against it. I had rented a cheap, decaying 2-story saltbox house perched precariously on a sheer cliff overlooking the Pacific. I needed absolute isolation to finish writing my novel. I wanted the dramatic inspiration of the sea. What I got was a masterclass in sensory deprivation and pure, unadulterated dread. The house was incredibly old. The wood was warped by decades of sea salt, and the foundation groaned constantly. But the worst part was the wind. It didn't blow, it battered. It screamed through the loose shingles, rattled the thin glass of the window panes, and forced freezing, damp drafts under every door. It was my second week in the house when the whispering started. A massive low-pressure system had rolled in off the dark water. The gale force winds were clocking in at 60 miles an hour. I was sitting at the heavy oak dining table in the center of the living room, bundled in a thick wool sweater, a single kerosene lamp casting long, trembling shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The power had been knocked out hours ago. As the wind whipped around the corners of the old house, a strange acoustic anomaly occurred. It wasn't a high-pitched whistle. It was a low, rhythmic murmuring. Mumble. Whisper. Shh. I stopped typing on my battery-powered laptop. I held my breath, straining my ears against the roar of the ocean outside. Whenever a particularly violent gust of wind slammed into the eastern side of the house, the draft would push through the old iron ventilation grates near the ceiling, carrying a sound that was horrifyingly human. It sounded exactly like 2 men having a hushed, frantic conversation in the next room. I stood up. The hardwood floor was freezing against my thick socks. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed instantly by the roaring storm. The wind howled again. The iron grate rattled. "Wait until he sleeps,"
Too much noise. My blood turned to ice. My heart performed a slow, sickening roll in my chest. It wasn't acoustic pareidolia. It wasn't my brain trying to make patterns out of random noise. Those were distinct words. The cadence was urgent, secretive. Supernatural lore flooded my panicked mind. The locals in the fishing village a few miles down the coast had warned me about this stretch of land.
They talked about the drowned men, the restless spirits of shipwrecked sailors whose voices were forever trapped in the coastal gales, crying out from the freezing surf. I had scoffed at them. I was a man of logic. But standing in the pitch-black living room, listening to the wind speak, logic felt very fragile. Another massive gust hit the house. The timber groaned. "The back door is warped. We can force it." Panic, cold and electric, exploded in my chest. That wasn't a ghostly lament. That was a plan. My breathing became rapid, short, frantic. I grabbed my heavy steel flashlight from the table and sprinted toward the kitchen. The back door. I needed to check the back door. I threw my weight against the heavy wood, slamming the deadbolt into place, dragging a heavy oak chair and wedging it under the brass knob. I backed away, my chest heaving, the flashlight beam shaking violently in my hands. The storm outside reached a deafening crescendo. The wind roared like a freight train. I stared up at the large, rusted ventilation grate directly above the kitchen island. That was where the strongest draft was coming from. That was where the voices were entering the house, carried by the wind from the cliffs outside. I needed to silence it. I needed to block the wind. I scrambled to the utility drawer, pulled out a thick roll of silver duct tape and a heavy plastic trash bag. I dragged the kitchen island directly under the grate, climbed up onto the cold granite countertop, and began frantically taping the thick plastic over the iron slats. I sealed every corner. I completely blocked the draft. Instantly, the freezing breeze hitting my face stopped. The roaring noise of the wind outside became muffled, pushed back to the exterior of the house. The kitchen fell into a heavy, dead silence. I let out a shaky, hysterical gasp of relief. It was over. I had blocked the ghostly wind. I climbed down from the island, my legs trembling. I stood in the pitch-black kitchen, bathed only by the beam of my flashlight resting on the counter. Then, the floorboards directly above my head groaned. Creak. A heavy, deliberate footstep. I froze. I went stock still. The wind outside was completely blocked. The house was sealed. But the sound didn't come from outside. It came from the ceiling. Then, a voice spoke. It wasn't carried by a draft. It wasn't muffled by the wind. It was crystal clear, echoing from the attic hatch just 3 feet away from where I was standing. "He taped the vent," a gruff, incredibly real human voice whispered from the dark crawlspace above me. "The wind won't mask our voices anymore. Just pry the hatch open. Let's get this over with." My stomach violently dropped. The air was sucked out of my lungs. It wasn't the ghosts of drowned sailors howling in the gale. The wind hadn't been carrying voices into the house. 2 men had broken into my attic days ago. They had been living up there, shivering in the cold, waiting for the perfect storm to hit. They knew the howling gale would mask the sounds of their footsteps and their whispers, as they planned exactly how to kill me in the dark. I didn't scream. I grabbed the flashlight, abandoned my keys, abandoned my car, and threw myself out the front window, sprinting blindly into the freezing, roaring tempest of the Pacific night. We write poems about the wind. We tell ghost stories about the voices in the storm. But the most horrifying truth in the world is that the devil doesn't ride the wind. He just uses the noise of the storm to hide the sound of his breathing right above your head. There is a crushing metallic silence that blankets the industrial wastelands of the American Rust Belt in the dead of winter. When a massive rail yard is abandoned to the elements, it doesn't just rust, it rots. It becomes a sprawling, labyrinthine graveyard of hollowed-out boxcars and jagged steel husks. I was a freelance urban photographer. My obsession was capturing the haunting, skeletal beauty of forgotten infrastructure. It was mid-February, well past 2 a.m., and the temperature had plummeted to a bitter 10 degrees. I was deep inside the perimeter of the decommissioned Black Creek rail yard in Pennsylvania, completely alone, enveloped by the pitch-black night. The air was dense and freezing. It carried the sharp, sour scent of oxidized iron, decaying diesel, and ancient grease. Every time the wind blew, the entire rail yard would groan and shriek as thousands of tons of rusted metal ground together. I was standing in a narrow corridor between two massive, decaying freight trains, setting up my tripod for a long exposure shot. The only light was the pale, sickly glow of a half-moon reflecting off the frost-covered gravel. I adjusted my camera lens, holding my breath to keep the fog of my exhalation from ruining the shot. Then, the metallic groaning of the wind stopped. The absolute silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. My ears rang in the vacuum. I stood perfectly still, my bare fingers freezing against the metal dials of my camera. Crunch. Scrape. It was a sharp, distinct sound. It came from the shadows, roughly 40 yards down the narrow corridor of trains. It wasn't the wind. It was the heavy, rhythmic sound of loose gravel being displaced by something moving. I squinted into the pitch-black abyss between the boxcars. At first, I saw nothing but jagged, overlapping shadows. But then, a massive, dark silhouette detached itself from the side of a rusted train wheel. It was a beast. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. It was massive, easily the size of a full-grown black bear, completely covered in thick, dark, matted fur. But it wasn't moving like a bear. It was scurrying low to the ground on all four limbs, moving with a terrifying, scuttling speed. It was darting from the shadow of one train car to the next, entirely silent, except for the faint crunch of the gravel. Native American folklore flooded my panicked mind, the legends of the skinwalker. The Navajo nightmares of ancient witches who draped themselves in the skins of beasts, moving on four legs with impossible speed, waiting in the dark to steal the faces of the lost. I was entirely defenseless. I was miles away from my car, trapped in an iron maze. Crunch, scrape. It was closing the distance. 30 yards, 20 yards. It was zigzagging between the rusted wheels, keeping its massive, fur-covered body pressed flat against the freezing earth. It was hunting me. Panic, cold and electric, exploded in my chest. My breathing became rapid, short, frantic. I grabbed the heavy, military-grade tactical flashlight from my belt. My thumb hovered over the heavy rubber button. The creature darted into the open corridor, just 15 yards away from me. It stopped, dead in its tracks, its massive shoulders hunched,
sniffing the frozen air. I squeezed the button. Click.
A blinding 3,000-lumen beam of white light ignited the corridor. The beam hit the beast dead center. The creature froze. Then, the horrifying transformation began. It didn't melt. It didn't magically morph. With a sickening sequence of loud, popping joints and heavy grunts, the beast slowly uncoiled its front limbs from the gravel. It raised its massive, hunched shoulders. It straightened its spine. It stood up on two legs. I stopped breathing. The air in my lungs turned to ice. The light didn't reveal a werewolf. It didn't reveal a supernatural monster from ancient mythology. It revealed a man. He was at least 6'3", emaciated and filthy.
His face was smeared with black grease and dried blood. He wasn't covered in fur. He was wearing the heavy, rotting,
blood-soaked hide of a massive deer, draped entirely over his back and head to break up his human silhouette in the dark. He hadn't been magically transforming. He had been crawling on his hands and knees over the frozen, jagged gravel. He had dropped to all fours specifically to stay below my eye level, using the shadows of the train wheels to stalk me completely undetected. He wanted me to think I was alone. The man in the animal skin didn't shield his eyes from the blinding light. He just stared at me. His eyes were wide, manic, and terrifyingly vacant. He slowly lowered his right hand, which had been concealed beneath the thick fur of the hide. His fist was wrapped tightly around a heavy, rusted iron railway spike. He smiled, a wide, jagged, horrifying grin that cracked the dried blood on his cheeks. I didn't scream. I abandoned my $2,000 camera on its tripod. I spun around on my heel and sprinted blindly into the pitch-black labyrinth of rusted steel, driven by pure, primal adrenaline. We terrify ourselves with stories of shapeshifters and monsters hiding in the dark. We want to believe the evil in the world is supernatural, because the most horrifying truth a human mind can process is that the real monsters don't need magic to hunt you. They just need the skin of a dead animal, the patience to crawl on their hands and knees, and a rusted piece of iron waiting in the dark. There is a terrifying vulnerability that comes with modern architecture. I had rented a beautiful minimalist cabin in the remote San Juan Mountains of Colorado for a winter retreat. The entire western wall of the house was made of floor-to-ceiling double-paned glass. During the day, it offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the snow-covered pines. But at night, when the sun dropped behind the jagged peaks and the interior lights were on, the glass transformed. It became a giant black mirror. You couldn't see 10 feet into the dark woods outside, but whatever was out there in the freezing night could see every single inch of you. You were living in a brightly lit terrarium. It was a Tuesday night in deep December. The temperature outside had plummeted to a brutal -10 degrees. I was sitting on the leather sofa, bathed in the warm, ambient glow of a reading lamp, nursing a mug of black coffee. The house was dead quiet, save for the low, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of the baseboard heaters. It was comfortable. It was secure. Then I felt it. It wasn't a sound. It was a heavy, primal instinct. The tiny hairs on the back of my neck stood at attention. A sudden, suffocating pressure dropped over the room. I felt the undeniable physical sensation of being watched. I slowly lowered my coffee mug to the table. I turned my head and looked out at the massive wall of black glass. At first, I only saw the reflection of my own living room, the sofa, the lamp, the bookshelf. But then, my eyes adjusted to the darkness just beyond the pane. Standing on the wooden deck, just at the edge of the ambient light spilling from the house, was a figure. My breath caught in my throat. I sat stock still. It was wearing a heavy, dark winter coat, its hands shoved deep into its pockets. It was standing completely rigid, facing the glass. A wave of dread washed over me. I stood up slowly, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. I took a step closer to the glass, trying to pierce the glare. The figure didn't move. It didn't flinch. I took another step. I was only 5 feet from the glass now. The pale moonlight filtered through the clouds, illuminating the figure's face. My blood turned to ice. My stomach violently plummeted. It looked human, but my brain instantly, violently rejected it. It was the uncanny valley in its purest, most horrifying form.
The proportions were entirely, sickeningly wrong.
The eyes were massive, bulging slightly, completely devoid of the natural reflex to blink. They were entirely black, spaced just an inch too far apart on the skull. The skin was unnaturally smooth, possessing a waxy, flawless sheen that caught the light like polished plastic. But the mouth paralyzed me. It was stretched into a wide, jagged, impossible smile. It was an ear-to-ear grin that bared far too many teeth. The lips were pulled so tight that the skin around the jaw looked ready to tear. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was a grotesque, mechanical imitation of human emotion, sculpted by something that had no soul. It was an entity mimicking a man, and it was doing a terrifyingly poor job. I couldn't breathe. My chest locked. Pure, unadulterated panic exploded in my veins. I was staring at a monster. An alternate.
A demon from the deep woods pressing itself against my fragile glass cage. I backed away. My trembling legs hit the edge of the coffee table. The smiling thing didn't break eye contact. It slowly raised a pale, stiff hand from its pocket. Tap, tap, tap. It knocked a single knuckle against the thick glass. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. The wide, horrifying grin never wavered. Then, the lights in the cabin violently snapped off. Total, suffocating darkness. Crash! The sound of shattering glass erupted from the kitchen at the back of the house. The heavy thud of a boot hitting the floorboards echoed through the dark. I didn't scream. My survival instinct finally overrode my paralysis. I scrambled to the floor, crawling frantically behind the heavy kitchen island, grabbing the heavy iron fire poker from the hearth on my way. I held my breath, gripping the iron so tightly my knuckles ached. Heavy, methodical footsteps crunched on the broken glass in the kitchen. Crunch. Step. Crunch. The figure walked into the living room. The pale moonlight from the snow outside cast a dim blue glow over the room. The intruder stopped in the center of the floor. I peered around the edge of the granite island, my heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm. The figure stood in the moonlight. It slowly raised both of its hands to its jawline. There was a thick, wet, tearing sound. The creature gripped its own deformed face and pulled. The waxy skin stretched, warped, and peeled backward. My blood ran cold. The sheer horror of the realization crushed me. It wasn't a monster pulling off its human disguise. It was a man pulling off a monster. He dropped the heavy, custom-made silicone mask onto the floor. Underneath was a completely normal, heavily scarred human man, breathing heavily in the cold air. In his right hand, he held a roll of silver duct tape and a long, serrated hunting knife. He hadn't been a demon. He was a calculated, methodical predator. He knew exactly how the human brain worked. He knew that if you look out your window and see a man, you immediately grab your phone and run out the back door. But if you look out your window and see a physical impossibility, a monster with a distorted, uncanny smile, your brain short-circuits. You freeze. You are utterly paralyzed by the supernatural terror standing perfectly still in your living room, while his accomplice quietly cuts the power and breaks the back window. I gripped the iron poker, preparing to fight for my life in the dark. We spend our childhoods checking under the bed for monsters with twisted faces. But the most terrifying truth is that the devil knows we are afraid of ghosts, and he will gladly wear a rubber mask to freeze you in place before he strikes.